Good morning, everyone, and thank you for making the time today to attend our webinar on working with Muslim individuals and families, culturally competent care, led by our speaker, Rupa Katapa. The Muslim community within California, as well as the entire U.S., is one of the largest growing communities and encompasses a set of extremely diverse histories, ethnicities, educational backgrounds, socioeconomic status, beliefs, values, and views. This rich diversity necessitates effective and culturally appropriate case management appraisal techniques while working with Muslim individuals and families. Our goal by the end of the webinar is for you, the audience, to be able to demonstrate an understanding of the contributing factors that comprise the Muslim identity, develop knowledge of some core values and beliefs that guide the experience of psychological distress and help-seeking behaviors with Muslim individuals and their families, identify and analyze OCAT engagement and appraisal techniques that can be utilized when working with the Muslim population. Rupa, our presenter today, has 15 years of experience of clinical practice with survivors of trauma, both domestic and international, including Africa and the Middle East. Her clinical practice has included working with survivors of torture, human trafficking, domestic violence, sexual violence, and gender-based violence. Her primary professional interests include understanding gender-based violence globally, cross-cultural identities, resilience in traumatized populations, treatment of complex trauma, grief, loss, and mourning, and fostering the development of future social workers through education and supervision. She currently manages the MSW Violence Against Women and Children Certificate Program that offers specialized education through the Center on Violence Against Women and Children at Rutgers University. Rupa was the former director of the Cross-Cultural Counseling Center, a mental health program for refugees and immigrants at the International Institute of New Jersey. Next slide. As always, we want to hear your experiences, recommendations, and challenges delivering culturally competent OCAT appraisals. Please don't be shy with sharing your knowledge and questions. If you have questions, please type it in the questions pod located on the side. You can see that in front of you. And we will be monitoring the questions and have reserved time at the end of the presentation for you to, for us to go through questions. The next slide, please. There will be a quick evaluation poll at the end of the presentation, which you can respond to by clicking on the radio button next to your preferred response. All the materials from today's webinar, including the slide deck, as well as the transcript and recording, will be posted on the Learning and Support Center. As a reminder, this is a two-part webinar series. Part 2, which will take place on June 19, will dive deeper into those culturally appropriate engagement and appraisal techniques and discuss possible and effective intervention strategies for working with Muslim individuals and families. We highly encourage everyone to register for Part 2 of this series, as it will build on the knowledge and content delivered in today's presentation. With that, I will turn it over to Rupa. Rupa?
Hi, good morning. Thank you very much, Brianna and Christina, for doing the introductions. So good morning, everybody, and welcome to the part 1 of this seminar. I'm very happy to be able to speak on this subject. And before I begin, I just want to first say my deepest gratitude for the work that you all do and for your interest in learning about this population, because this is I'm just going to move the slide. This is a population that's really diverse with, and Christina talked about the diversity within their, cultural beliefs, traditions, their ways of living. And I think when you are serving them in your capacity, it is so important and so vital to understand that identity to be able to provide effective services. So I have a few pictures over here. I wish I could have packed them in with more, but there wasn't enough space. But this is obviously not completely representative of the whole group. There are many more communities that fall within the Muslim population. So let's talk a little bit about the workshop objectives. Now, I have 1 hour to speak about this population, and I did want to have the part one focusing more and really getting a sense of the identity, the Muslim identity, and all the different variables, the contributing factors that add to a person's awareness of themselves and what that looks like. So I think that's truly like a contextual framework that you would put together and keep in your minds as you're doing the appraisal. We will be obviously going back and forth with the OCAT appraisal tool to see how you could ask those questions. What are some of the challenges and concerns when you're asking this information? I can only imagine how difficult that must be. So the part of the workshop objective is really to sort of get a sense of this population, to understand what that cultural and religious identity looks like, what some of those challenges are and risk factors as well, and be able to use the OCAT appraisal tool to really apply the information that you have learned to be able to provide effective assessment and really respond to those needs as well. So I don't want to spend too much time on statistics because the slides are going to be up for you. You can take a look at it. But I always think that statistics are really important in us understanding the scope of the problem or scope of the issue that we are working with. So as you all heard a little while ago, Christina mentioned it, but this is a really fast growing religion. So there were 1.8 billion Muslims in the world as of 2015. It's only increased, and even within the US, it's the fastest growing immigrant group. So just by the sense of the numbers, you can kind of understand that we are working with a very large population, and this was only going to keep getting larger. So now is a good time to get a sense of the population that you're working with, understand this population so you can better design and develop your services based on that. So again, I have the slide about the number of Muslims in the US as it continues to grow. And you can see the numbers from 2007 to 2017 and sort of the bit of a steep growth over here. And Islam is growing the fastest. So you can see again, estimated population size from 2010 to 2050. And like I said, I don't want to spend too much time. I just love putting numbers in because it kind of gives us a sense of what we're working with. So what we need to know, some basics before we even move forward, is understand what comprises the total Muslim population. So there are the Shias and the Sunnis, which are the two main groups. And the Shias and Sunnis are primarily two groups as we know them, but in the United States, the Sunnis are the more popular group as opposed to the Shias. Shias are primarily in Iraq, and the Shia Muslims, a small population in India as well, but Sunnis are the more 87 to 90%, as you can see, that that are more sort of more available or more visible in the community. So these are the two sects in Islam, and they were created after the death of Prophet Muhammad. And they have the same core tenets, but they have some differences in beliefs and practices. So as I said before, Sunnis are the majority, and most Shias live in Iran, Pakistan, India, and Iraq. So even within the Shia group, there are these different schools of Islamic jurisprudence, and you don't need to know the details, but just kind of keep it in your head that there can be differences. The whole idea about putting the slide is, and for you to understand that even within what appears to be a similar group, there can be very different groups of people with very different beliefs and practices. So we have the Ithna, the Asharis, the Ismailis, the Zaydis, the Alevis, and the Alawite school of Islamic jurisprudence, while in the Sunnis we have the Hanafi, Malifi, Shafi, etc., etc. Now in the US you will see the Nation of Islam movement as well, and Sufis who also fall within this larger group. So what do we need to know about Islam? um, when you're meeting with a client or a family, an Islamic family, a Muslim family, it's kind of important to kind of get a sense of at least some background information before you get into the room and sit across from them. Just gives you a sense of comfort and some confidence, right? Islam is a monotheistic religion based on the revelations of Prophet Muhammad. So and these are all recorded in the sacred book, the Holy Quran. And Islam in Arabic means submission to the will of God. So when you think about the religion, it really is a framework. It's a way of life, right? It prescribes codes of behaviors, ethics, social principles, values. So it's more than just a way of prayer or just a religion as we sometimes tend to understand religion. It really is a way of life. And Sharia, you've heard of the word Sharia, the Sharia law, Sharia. What Sharia really means is a path that Muslims would follow in their life, right? And in full, actually, Sharia in full translates to path to life-giving water. So it really is a spiritual metaphor to how water is significant in the barren desert, the condition in which Islam was founded. So it's sort of there's a meaning to why certain words and certain paths are used in within this religion. Religion is very significant, if not the most important. It's a psychosocial factor for a Muslim individual's identity development. Now, keep in mind while I'm talking about this, is that not every person who self-identifies as a Muslim practices the religion. And sometimes when I do these trainings, there's always this fear in my mind that this information can also be very harmful when you're stereotyping people within a certain group. So what I always like to say is make sure that you're getting this information, but looking at individuals as individuals, looking at each family as separate from the last Muslim family that you met. This information is really trying to keep a contextual framework in your mind as you ask questions, as you communicate, as you connect with your clients and your and families, right? So it's just information that you keep in mind that sort of helps you design your questions, helps you ask those questions with empathy and compassion and respect, right? So because you know a little bit, so the anxiety doesn't kick in as much. So religion and spirituality, again, not mutually exclusive. And the Quran really describes the way in which Allah should be worshipped. So the Sunnah, as we call it, includes all the known sayings, the advices, the actions of the Prophet Muhammad. And quite often, Muslim individuals, when they are in life situations and experiencing crisis, very often rely on these teachings, on these advices as written in the Holy Quran to be able to find solutions, to be able to find a resolution for the problems that they're facing. So it's kind of important to know where that is coming from, right? Because when you hear people saying, I'm not going to do this, or I don't agree with this, you know, we as providers have to take a step back and get a sense of where that is coming from. And if we understand the source that motivates or demotivates or provides information to the client, it helps us sort of see the problem through the client's eyes, see where it's coming from, and then be better able to address that problem. So it really, for those of you who have heard about the attachment theory, right? We talk about secure attachment that is linked to overall well-being. And in this population, the attachment to God, the attachment to Allah, the belief, the dependence is really a huge resource in helping us utilize the religion in helping the client move forward in solving the issues. So Islam also highlights the importance of community, right? Rather than looking inward, we are looking at the external world, and really looking at the person in context to the family, to the community, to the bigger community, right? And to the culture, of course. So in terms of Muslim families, we look at the major ethnic groups within the American Muslim community. There's African Americans, South Asians, Arabs, and many Arabs, for you to know, and this is quite often confused, Arabs are not always they can be non-Muslims too. So not all Arabs are Muslims. So it's important to understand that before making any assumptions. South Asians are a very large group in the U.S. Muslim community, as are African Americans as well. And within each of these groups, they're diverse ethnically, right? They're diverse racially, but they are bound by that religion. So it's important to kind of understand the religious sort of base to this population. And some of the things that I've written in the slide are quite often cultural as well, and not always prescribed by the religion. So child's foremost loyalty is to the family, the clan, or the kin. And this is very important as we do these assessments and appraisals, is really understand why the child is giving you certain information, or the family member, the husband or the wife, the parent is speaking in a certain way about the child. Emphasis on putting the family before the self, and this I cannot reinforce, again and again. This is so important, is understanding that when you're doing, even if you're talking to an individual, in family therapy, we talk about, you're sitting with one person in the room, right? And you're talking about their perspective of the problem or their experiences, but understand that this person who you're talking to is really bringing in their experiences with their families. So even though you can't see the father, the mom, the spouse, the sister, the brother, the uncle sitting in the room with you, that's the person is talking with all of these people in their head. And that happens to you, to me, to all of us, right? We may be talking, one-on-one with somebody, but sometimes we are thinking about, oh, what would my uncle say if this, oh, I remember my aunt saying this, or this is what I was taught as a child, and that is being brought forward. So all of these people, our family context is always present, and for this population, more so, right? So family honor and status central to the individual's and family's goal in practicing conformity, right? And extended family systems and family dynamics guided by rules. So when we talk about, family systems being there within this community, especially, there are very clear prescribed rules, right? Whether you're talking about gender norms, or you're talking about just your responsibilities or duties towards a family, they're very clearly prescribed. So it is important to be able to get a sense of where that is coming from, understand what's guiding those decisions prior to making your conclusions or making your assumptions. So family honor, and we'll talk a little about that, because this quite often really impacts a person's sort of response to their current life situation. So when we talk about family honor, and you would have heard about that if you're working with this population, you would hear about the words, reputation, honor, shame, all of these words, right? And I would really encourage you to pay attention to those situations that really bring forward these concepts, right? So honor is a collective term, and I may have a slide after this, but you know what, let me go to the next slide, and then I'll come back to the family structure. So just one last piece of this that I want to kind of talk about is Islamophobia. And this is not just a term, it's a real deal, right? Islamophobia is a range of negative feelings towards Muslim and their religion, from generalized bigotry to intolerance and prejudice. And this is not just behavior that we see on and off. This is consistent, this is prevalent, and it's pervasive. So, and it has some really long standing impact on the emotional and physical well-being on individuals and families. And I see my clients in my private practice, and I can't begin to tell you how deep and how pervasive this influences, this impact is on their lives. It's every day. Imagine, many years ago when I first came to this country, and I still think about African American mothers, who would be worried about their sons going out to work and to school, and more so now, we've heard so many stories about Black Lives Matter, and the prejudice, and the police brutality, and all of this. And I don't mean to sound political, but it was always my colleagues, my African American colleagues, and they would talk about it, and I would empathize with them, but I would never sort of really, I guess, not be able to really understand the pain in their fears and their anxieties. And then 9/11 happened, right? And as a South Asian, my son who lives in New York City, he's 22 years old, and nobody can differentiate between him and a Muslim. And when I read these stories and these attacks in New York City, and I keep telling him, just be safe, don't go to a crowded place, and if you get pulled over, or if you get stopped, answer all the questions. And now, after these years, I really understand what those anxieties and fears are. When your identity, the color of your skin, your name can really cause you death and cause you pain, and what that means to people living with this every day of their lives, right? So I really want you to kind of understand that within this population, given all the other challenges, this day-to-day challenge of living within an atmosphere and environment that's not welcoming, and what that does to their sense of identity and sense of existence, and general peace that we each of us have a right to live with, right? So that's a real thing. So we see a lot of microaggressions towards Muslims. And each of these, believe me, you will see when you sit across from them, because they're already coming into your room sort of expecting that, or have experienced it, and are probably thinking that you may be one of those people who are going to say or do the same. So in endorsing religious stereotypes, right? Sometimes we, stereotyping a Muslim person as a terrorist, or a Jewish person as cheap, those are the religious stereotypes that we have. And sometimes they come out in our conversations, whether intentionally or unintentionally. Exoticization. Exoticization. And I, as a South Asian, can completely relate to that. Is this idea that you dress in a certain religion's garb, or garments for fashion or pleasure, right? People ask these questions about, oh, the hijab, do you have a specific material for it? Do you get it hand embroidered? Or, things like that. Really making it into an exotic thing rather than just a normal, real part of their cultural identity. Pathology of different religious groups, telling someone that they're in the wrong religion. Quite often we'll have people talking about, oh, it's, keeping rosa, or, during Ramadan, how difficult that is. Why would you do that? Why would you deprive yourself of? So really this disrespect, and sometimes it comes from a place of ignorance. Sometimes it just comes from a place of lack of compassion, and disrespect. Assumption of one's own religious identity as the norm. We see that a lot. Assumption of religious homogeneity, that everybody within the Muslim culture is the same. Sometimes we, think that everybody who is a Muslim who's wearing a hijab follows the religion in the same way, assuming that all the Muslim people, if they don't cover their hair, then there's something wrong with them, or they're not religious enough, or they're not proud of the religion just because they're not covering their hair, right? Denial of religious prejudice. Sometimes people will just say, oh no, it's the same thing as being colorblind, right? Not really being able to see color, or be able to feel that I am absolutely don't think this exists, which is also doing a lot of disservice to this population. So I want to talk about Miriam. Now, Miriam is a client I worked with, and I want to be able to use or utilize her life experience in going through some of the information that I'm going to, come to. So Miriam is a 19-year-old newly married Muslim Moroccan woman. Um, she's married to a U.S. citizen, and it was an arranged marriage by both families, as is sometimes quite normal. I don't know why I have two commas in there, but ignore that. And it was, the families met. They looked at, the lifestyles and the rules in the family, and the way they practice the religion, and everything kind of matched. And it was an arranged marriage. With Mariam and her husband Ahmed, and she came to the U.S. 3 months after her wedding. So this was she'd come here once prior on vacation, but had never really lived here. This is the first time. She didn't have any family or friends over here. She came in and was living in Jersey City with her husband, and his mother. And her sister-in-law, husband's sister, lived close by in the neighborhood as well. So Miriam was in college when her father announced it was time for her to get married, as happens quite often within this community. And he said, you're at a marriageable age and it's time for you to find a husband. And he found somebody who was qualified. And he also promised her that this person would allow her to continue her studies post her marriage. That was actually one of the things she told me, that the only reason I said that I would move away from my family so far away was because, Ahmed said he would be very open to me continuing my studies. She was very good in school and she really wanted to study. And so she got married, came here within 3 months. He was very abusive. There was physical, emotional, sexual abuse. And finally, when the police found her, she was actually had broken a window in her apartment and had stepped outside. She was walking around the streets without any, a coat, without any shoes. And that's when she was taken to the police department. And then we were contacted, and she had then we had sent her to social services. And so she had a broken window, and that's how she came out. And all her family were in Morocco. She had no family here. She used to visit the mosque over here and knew a few people through the mosque, but didn't really know anybody, one-on-one. She had also realized they took her to she had injuries on her from the abuse, and so they went to do a rape kit and check out her physical injuries, and that's when she realized that she was pregnant. So I want you to kind of keep this scenario in mind, and I'll tell you a little bit about what happened as I go through this information. So when I talked to her about, her sort of understanding of the marriage and how she was dealing with this abuse, this is the information that came up, and the understanding, right? When it comes to this population. So marriage is half of faith and the rest is fear of Allah, right? As it says in the hadith. So quite often, that is how the marriage is. Half your faith is done when you get married. Marriage is really the heart of social and religious life. It's a very important part of your life. And children at a very young age are told this, they're taught this, right? So you grow up knowing that you will get married, and marriage is going to be a very important part of your life, and your duties and responsibilities in fulfilling that role is going to be a huge part of your fulfilling Allah's will. So this is a very inherent, deeply ingrained belief as they grow up, and it's not always talked about or discussed, but it's believed. It's very it's a part of their identity, right? Culturally specific marriage beliefs, right? There's certain roles that genders have. There's a certain role that your husband has. You as as a wife has a certain role, and there is obedience, but there's also sense of responsibility. So the partner, the male has the partner has a very clear, prescribed responsibility and duty towards his family, towards his wife, just as the wife has a very clearly prescribed roles and duties towards her husband. So what happens when there is abuse within this relationship is the sort of a negation of the self begins, right? So Hassoun and Phillips in their research talk about this negation of self where, marriage is normative behavior, right? It's socially sanctioned form of sexual activity because dating is not allowed and not encouraged, obviously, is not and marriage therefore becomes the central to the religious practice, right? It's very prescriptive in nature. And so the meaning of Islam, when we go back, is submission to God. And I want you to kind of pay attention to this and really understand where this comes from. So now, when you're submitting to God, you're also submitting, it requires you to submit to your husband and to the will of the Muslim community, because it's important that you don't bring shame to your family. So what happens is when you are being obedient to your husband, to God, to the community, to your family, somewhere along the way, you begin to accept the unacceptable. You begin to accept and tolerate the abuse. And you start negating what is self-interest, as we call it, or protection or preservation of self, because now preservation or importance of self is given to others. That's what you think you're expected to do. That's what your religion or culture expects from you. So then you end up with really not understanding who you are, or really negating your own sense of self. And when we see in many of these families, the mothers, the mother-in-laws, the grandmothers, not really being able to support the child, whether there's a survivor of sexual violence or domestic violence, quite often they themselves have gone through this process of negation of self, right? And have ended up sort of really giving up, right? And sort of believing the that faithful, or being fulfilling the prescriptive nature, the prescribed rules, that is important. So therefore, what I think, or what I believe, or what is good for me is not important, right? And then when you look at this process, they end to a point of saturation where it comes as a life and death issue. And quite often this point of saturation also comes to women when children are involved. When children become a part of the domestic violence is when they sort of reach that point where they're like, okay, that's it. Now I'm going to move to the next process, which is self-realization, getting kula. Kula is divorce when it's initiated by the woman. And usually in Islamic countries, there's Islamic courts where this judicial decree is granted. However, in the US, it's very difficult to find an Islamic court that's going to provide this decree. So quite often women end up going to the local imams, right, to ask for khula, to be able to get divorced. And the imams, when they get involved, have their own opinions about marriage and the importance of marriage, and are disapproving of divorce. So quite often it becomes very challenging for women, even when they know they wanted to get out of the relationship, to be actually able to leave the abusive situation, right? So just for you to understand that it's much more complicated than, why don't you leave the family? Why don't you leave your husband if he's abusing you? It's very deep, because sometimes when they are divorcing or getting out of that abusive situation, they also have to give up their families, give up the community, be ostracized. So just take a moment to imagine that, not having anybody who's in your on your side. And with Mariam, when she went to the hospital, there was a nurse who belonged to her community, and the nurse told her, like, what are you doing? You can't be calling the police and involving the police in your private matters. And I'll take you home. You don't want to go back to him? That's fine. I understand. You come home with me. I'll take you home. I belong to your community. We'll figure this out. And, we talk about providers and boundaries and professional boundaries and ethics. As a social worker, that's always at the top of my brain. Well, this nurse took Mariam home. And when she took her home with 2 days, they talked her into going back to her husband, called in an imam, and basically said, he's made a mistake. He's not going to do it again. You can't really divorce him or separate from him. Now you're pregnant. You really need to be with him. He will forgive you if you can do A, B, and C. He will provide for you, and we are going to make sure that the abuse doesn't happen. And the imam was called in, and he refused to. He basically told her that you cannot call the police and take him to jail. That's against our culture and religion. What are people going to say? Your family is going to be very ashamed of you. Everybody's going to, this is going to bring shame to your family. And unfortunately, what she did was she went back to him, right? And she went back to him, and the abuse started again, right? So finally, when she did get removed, it moved from a simple assault to an aggravated assault, because he criminally restrained her in an apartment without food or water, and while she was pregnant, and there was intense amount of physical and sexual violence. So keeping that in mind, we come to the family structure and values, right? So when we talk about honor, which is so important in this case, it really is a collective term. It refers not simply to the social behavior of one person, but the collective behavior of a family. So Mariam was not just one individual who was being physically and sexually abused. She became representative, or her decisions became representative of the whole group that she was the face of: her family, her community, her husband's family, right? So within these honor cultures, An individual is expected to be responsible for the behavior of other members of his or her family, the tribe, or the community. And it's really a form of social identity grouping, right? So the licensing of this collective social control, when viewed within the context of patriarchal structures of family and marriage, can create an intense form of oppression for women. And why am I talking about this? Because when you do the OCAT domestic abuse appraisal, this is what you might have to keep in mind as you ask those questions. So within the Muslim families, again, every family is different, but there are some patterns of collectivist, right, patriarchal family system. It's group focused. People are looking at a family as a whole, not individuals by themselves. There's a hierarchical structure based on age and gender. So people who are older are given so much more respect and are expected to kind of be the decision makers. And in terms of gender, the male head of the family. So when you have people come to your room, you quite often will see that a female is accompanied by a male relative, whether it's a spouse or a father. Sometimes it doesn't, they're not even biologically related. They'll just come in. I've had many of these opportunities where I have a client being accompanied, and to be respectful of that is important, because when we think about the Western model of, we always try to separate, right? We always look at individuals as individuals, and we want to empower their ability to self-determination, as we call it. But within this culture, the self-determination comes based on the context, the family context, right? So we can empower people, but it has to be within the context of the family. So firstborn child, especially male, has significant authority. This can quite often be a huge responsibility on males, and kind of create negative, adverse impact on them. Male children are often equated with prosperity. Mothers who have male children are given extra, sort of, they can get extra power or have a status in the family. And this also can be more cultural than prescribed by the religion. So I just want you to kind of keep that in mind. Is not always prescribed by the religion, but can be cultural as well. Negative emotional expression is perceived as indicative of unhealthy self-absorption. So people talking about how painful their life is can be seen as really not, um, as per the religion prescribes, is really self-absorption. So focus on the family, focus on the well-being of others, then focus on your own well-being. And this sometimes translates into summarization. So people are more often, they talk about their pains and aches, and rather than really talk about themselves feeling sad or angry or frustrated. So kind of keeping that in mind, right? And what constitutes the family? When we talk about what we are looking at in a family context, over here it's a mother, father, child, right? Nuclear families. Within a Muslim environment, can be extended family members, mother-in-laws, grandparents, uncles, aunts. So looking at that whole thing in keeping that in your perspective. And the very clearly defined family roles and expectations. Family values autonomy. Autonomy is discouraged in children. So when children are sitting with parents, don't expect children to express their opinions. There is a generational interdependence. It's expected, it's welcomed. There's obedience, conformity, obligation, and shame. These are some of the broader, issues. And I know I'm going very quickly through this, but I think when we talk about some of this, it'll make sense as we look at the OCAT tool. So when we ask these questions, right, some of these are very descriptive. Now understand that the OCAT is a structured interview, right? Just like all other interviews, I'm glad that there's so many questions and they're very descriptive nature and kind of covering every part of what the information that you're trying to gather, so you can refer the client to effective services, you can understand what the situation is, you can evaluate them for their work readiness. But understand that when you ask like yes or no questions, you'll get yes or no answers, right? But sometimes it's important to ask open-ended questions where the client is kind of giving you answers to, let's say, between A and K, you're getting all the answers, right? So allowing them to provide some conversation, to provide you some information which really answers all those questions without you having to go through one question after the other. And I say this because when you and I was looking at some of the feedback that I'd got back from caseworkers. Quite often, when you ask, you know, yes or no questions, the person is on hyper alert, right? What's the next one coming? What's the next one coming? It doesn't really help with relationship building. And with the Muslim population, primarily, number one, right, is trust, is relationship. Just like I would imagine with any community, with any human being, they're giving you some really private information, personal information. And as a South Asian myself, right, I would be very uncomfortable answering questions for anyone who is not part of my family, or people that I know for years or I trust, right? So there's an automatic hypervigilance that kicks in. So when you're asking the question, it's always good to kind of talk about the weather to begin with, or just generally about their lives here, or bring in an icebreaker, whatever you're comfortable, and each person is comfortable with different language, right? So in asking questions that um, you know really provide, present yourself as a human being first, and then as a professional, and why you're asking these questions. You're not asking it because you want to, you know, talk about this, or just because you want to know. There's a purpose of this interview, and that confidentiality is going to be very, very important, very significant. So I'm going to move to the next slide, kind of just give you some information about some language that I would use. Now again, every person is different, each of you have your own style, each of you have your own way of asking questions. But one of the things that we had talked about initially is quite often individuals, when you're asking domestic violence questions, the spouse or the perpetrator might be sitting there, and how do you ask these questions, right? So within this community, or within this family, it's very important to provide respect to every member of the family, and not because the power dynamics are so great that you want to make sure that you are joining them and not separating yourself from that existent power dynamic. So you could say something like, thank you for accompanying your wife. I really appreciate that and recognize that it's so valuable for you to be here. But however, and I'm not sure if the policy requires it or not, but I would say something like, put it on your organization, say, a supervisor or whatever, we are really encouraged that each person is interviewed separately, just for the purposes of you honoring, keeping that respect and privacy within the family. If you don't mind, I would prefer to meet with your wife separately, and then I would meet with you separately, and not want your wife there. So sort of really balancing out that power, being very respectful, yet clearly saying that I need to ask these questions separately. When you're meeting with the wife, with a female, be very, reiterate confidentiality, and whatever your confidentiality policy is, and how what you're mandated to report. But also saying that as an adult in this country, all your information is between you and me, and without your consent, I cannot release this information to anybody else, including your husband, because laws in different countries are very different, right? So you want to make sure that she is a valuable individual, adult individual, and that her information is kept confidentially, because otherwise it's going to be, as it is going to be difficult for the person to talk about it, right? And then if you're not assuring them of confidentiality, it's going to be very, very difficult for them to give you any information. So again, I have some questions over here, ways that you can respond, and really, explaining that I'm trying my best to assist you. And I know this is really difficult, and I'm a stranger. Put it out on the table, right? Yes, I'm a stranger. I can't imagine how difficult it must be for you to answer these questions, but I'm not going to be able to help you till I have information from you. So I need your help to give me some information so I can best understand how I can help you. And then if you do feel that there is safety concerns, right, in the family, even if she's giving you some information that's putting up a red flag for you, you can go back and say, I'm really concerned regarding your safety and your children's safety. Always bring in children, because as a woman, as a female within a family, if you are going to make a decision, it's going to be so much easier if I have to make it for my children than I have to make it for myself, right? So always bring in the family context. Is, I really am concerned. Would it be okay if I ask you some questions? Or maybe you can come back later on when you feel like you can come in alone. I can give you some information. Make sure you have some resources, phone numbers. They can, we used to have these little palm cards that I used to hand out to the social services folks that they can just put into their clothes, actually, because many of them would not even have a pocketbook, so they couldn't keep it. And then if the spouse is waiting, they're like, what do you have in your hands? Like, what is this information? And they can feel very threatened, and you can actually cause more harm to them. So keep them little palm cards, the phone numbers, and put it, they can put it inside their shirts and when they take it, or keep it in, in a way that it's not conspicuous. So safety planning is really important when you see any sort of a red flag. And I wish I could spend more time on this, but I cannot, and we have to move on. But I would, if any of you have questions or concerns, feel free to bring those back to me. I'm just trying to see if I'm kind of covering everything here. Even when you're doing, and I'll talk about the mental health piece of it in terms of the suicide assessment, but if you're asking about firearms and things like that in the house, you can also say that, these are regular questions you have to ask everyone just to make sure that they're safe and, be very clear. So when we talk about domestic abuse, right, that's a term we are very familiar with in the US. Domestic abuse, there are statutes, there are laws that fall under it. But domestic abuse, when you ask a client who has no understanding of what that looks at, you want to separate the word domestic and abuse. All the stuff that falls within the term abuse, right? Explain that before you ask the questions, and what domestic means, because domestic could mean abuse in a family where there are other family members involved, not just your spouse, right? So it could be, in-laws, it could be parents, it could be uncles and aunts. So you want to make sure that when you're doing the interview, you clearly explain these terms to them. Don't assume that they know what these terms mean, right? So just want to kind of make a note of that. So I want to provide another case study when we go to the mental health and substance abuse piece of it. So Akram, and again, another one, this is also one of my clients. He's 20 years old, Pakistani male, lives at home with his parents. He's, doing in school, and he's not, does not practice his religion. He's abusing substances, having prescription pills, all of this stuff that I've written down over here. Brings his girlfriends home, spends the night with them at home, causes a great amount of distress to his religious mother. So his father is is an atheist, does not believe, he's Muslim, but he doesn't really practice the religion. He believes that everything exists because of science, and mother, on the other hand, is extremely religious. So when I was working with him, all of this sort of came on in our discussion, and I don't have a lot of time, but I do want to kind of talk about a little bit about the causes of mental illness. So when you're, talking about and asking these questions, understand that for this Muslim population, it can be biological causes, it could be psychosocial, and none of us really know. Quite often, even in the scientific world, we don't always know where it comes from. But a lot of clients believe that it is related to their not practicing their religion very well. So if you were to pray a little bit more, if you were doing the right kind of work, then you would not feel this. So quite often, clients will tell you that they have probably not done something right, and therefore they are experiencing this great amount of shame in this. It could be because it's genetically they're predisposed, their aunt had it, or somebody in their family had it, and therefore they have it. The chemical imbalance, is something that we explain that it is not always taken very well, but if it is, then they're able to feel less shame about it than because of something that they did. Stressful life events, traumatic childhood, right? The religious causes really kick in. A lot of times I get a lot of phone calls from people in the community about the jinn possession, right? Being possessed by the jinn, or simply, if I do more prayers, maybe I haven't been able to do it. And this is, what God has for me. So I have to bear it. I have to bear it to be able to get out of it, right? So when you are asking those questions within the form, there is a preamble, right, that you're referring to this form, you're asking these questions. But make sure that when you're asking mental health questions, make it more general health, right? So talk about, and let me go to the slide over here where you are basically saying, I'm going to be asking some questions about your health, but I also kind of say it in a way, in a kind of conversational way. Again, use your own language that you're comfortable with. Is, sometimes when we are stressed, it impacts our bodies. We feel tired, we feel fatigued, we feel unwell. And sometimes when our bodies are fatigued and unwell, we're running a fever, it impacts our minds as well. So our minds and bodies are kind of interdependent. So, when you get headaches and other physical ailments, they could be coming from your emotional health. So just kind of preamble that with that conversation where they can talk about that, because sometimes the religious causes, they do believe that depression is caused by the supernatural phenomenon, right? Illness is due to God's will or fate. And to be able to get to that point, you need to let them know you're normalizing it, right? Otherwise they won't talk to you about where it's coming from. They do believe that it's coming from a lack of faith or the moral transgressions, and that sorrow is caused by an individual's attitude and values. So they'll say, if my son just changes his attitude or prays a little bit more, it'll be different. So relating it to stress is a way for you to normalize it. Has there been any change in your stress levels? Like, so if you were to count yourself from 1 to 10, what would you rate it with? Do you think that your stress impacts your family or your life? So stress makes it more socially sanctioned as opposed to talking about mental health. Avoid the word mental, because sometimes mental has a very negative connotation um, in that conversation. Suicide is forbidden. It's haram, right, in Islam. So do not use that word. You can say, when life gets difficult, you have trouble. So with substance abuse as well, there's some religious implications, right? So it's not sanctioned by the religion. In when you're looking at substance abuse, it's forbidden. It's another thing that's haram in the religion. But it does not stop people from using substances. Sometimes because of the stress levels, we talked about the multiple stressors, they use it as a coping mechanism. And because it's not accepted by the religion, there's a huge amount of shame and guilt that accompanies a client. And Akram, for example, was abusing substances, prescription pills, and he couldn't look into his parents' eye. He was experiencing post-traumatic stress, and he was coping with the substances, yet could not talk to his parents about it. And there's a huge lack of education. So quite often I get calls from the hospitals where parents know that the child is in a difficult place, but is so ashamed of the fact that they have failed in teaching the child the right ways of following the religion, and the child is abusing substances, and because of the shame they don't reach out for services. This is a huge problem within this community. So you could simply ask questions like, what are your thoughts about alcohol consumption? Has it been a concern in your family? How is it seen in your family? How does your community deal with it, right? Help me understand. I use the word help me understand a lot, right? If using these substances, how is it impacting? So for my client, I asked Akram, tell me how your family feels about it. How does your mom deal with it? And in a very non-judgmental way. So I'm going to go to this last.
Oh,
Yes, I know we are finishing,
I was
right?
just gonna say, yeah. So I was gonna say when you reach a comfortable place to stop, maybe
Yeah,
stop there, and then we can pick up the rest in part two.
right. Yes, I'll do that. So I'm just going to
Okay.
go back to like this one slide over here. When you're doing an appraisal, it's really important to understand these four ideas: locus of control, communication, concept of self, and power distance, right? So I'm going to stop over here with this last tool over here, where you are building trust, which is essential. Confidentiality, I cannot tell you how important that is. Acknowledging the within the family cultural power for the power hierarchies, expressing empathy, and communication, acknowledging the idea of like touch, for example, shaking hands during Ramadan. As a female, you do not, shake hands with the male, right? Because then his fasting is basically taken away, and he has to redo that. So understanding some basic ideas about that. Eye contact, females are usually accompanied by a male relative, and sometimes by an older person. So being open, curious, and non-judgmental. So this is where I would like to end today's presentation, is using some of this. Go back to the slides that I talked about, and we will discuss the other slides in the next. There's some assessment tools, and these are things that you can read on your own too. So I'm just going to quickly go
And what we'll do is
to the
that
last piece. Yes.
oops, sorry, Rupa. I was
No,
just
that's
going to,
okay. This was the last one that I wanted to just kind of keep as we have the questions coming in, if that's okay.
yep, go ahead.
So just keeping in mind that the recognizing Muslims diversity, right? Don't avoid religion, don't avoid talking about it. Your awareness, self-awareness of your own prejudices and biases. Don't be afraid to ask, right? And just kind of reach out, build your own awareness, build your own knowledge base. So this is where I want to end today, and I would be happy to take some questions.
Thank you, Rupa. So, just as and I thank you, Rupa, especially you were trying to condense everything in about 1 minute at the very end
Yes.
there. We
Yes.
usually have, which is always stressful for speakers. So I certainly appreciate doing that. As Rupa alluded to, and as I mentioned at the beginning of this webinar, part 2 is scheduled for June 19th, and you can make sure you are registered for it. We'll put all the materials from today, including some additional materials and resources that Rupa has on the Learning Center. So make sure you go to that as well. So in the meanwhile, please type in the questions. We have a few already that have come in. Rupa, do you have any suggestions for working with colleagues who are openly critical of Muslims and Islam?
So I always talk about education and awareness, right? Even in my classroom, sometimes when students have very clear opinions, and we want people to be able to feel safe to express their opinions, right? That's where conversation and dialogue happens. We don't want to express to them that we don't agree and close that conversation. So I think if you are educated about this population, then I would encourage you to educate your colleagues, in a very non-judgmental fashion. Provide them with resources. Talk to them about, what research says, what facts and figures are, and then put together their opinion. And there'll always be people who, choose to believe have certain ideologies because it suits their agenda, and that's okay. We can't convert the world, right? But tolerance, especially when you're involved in social services and you're working with communities, tolerance, patience, compassion are such important assets and strengths to have. So what I would encourage you to do is really help, in an open dialogue. Don't be critical, but explain. Go for coffee, go for lunch, talk to your colleagues about your experiences, talk about what your learning is, and help educate your work environment. That's would be my response. That's what I do in my work environment as well.
Okay. Another question, what would be some activities women can do when they are limited to being around other women?
You're talking about the population. Is it specific to the clients?
I think so, yes.
Right. So, one of the things that I used to do in my in the agency, where we had a lot of women, we would sit down and, again, confidentiality keeps, and nobody wants to talk about their private lives, obviously, right? So we would have activities like, art. We would do some artwork with them. We would do beading. So we had somebody donate a bunch of beads to us, put them in a room, and have them design jewelry. It's very simple, doesn't cost a lot. Engage them in activities that where they can communicate with each other without fear of having to talk about their private lives. So they really bond in some of these activities, crocheting, knitting, for example. But for I personally have seen beading and art as two huge ways of helping women by themselves get together and sort of really bond, and creating some space for them to do that, and basically clarifying expectations that you're not coming to talk about your problems, but really helping them talk to each other generally about stuff, right? But also bond through an activity. I don't know if this answers the question.
And actually, there's a follow-on question. Any other activities is required as part of the Welfare to Work program to assist with employment and self-sufficiency?
So one of the things that I would do is try to assess their literacy levels, right? So ESL, for example, many of them feel very disempowered because of their language skills. So one of the things that we used to do very definitively was make sure that they're able to go for their ESL classes, which I believe you guys do as well, right? And even within, actually, it was interesting. I used to get a lot of referrals from the ESL instructor about domestic violence, and you were like, why would that be? Because quite often, during the acculturation stage, the domestic violence escalates because there is a power dynamic that changes within these environments when women start speaking English, get a job, move out of the house. And so therefore it is important that you are providing activities that do not endanger the women, and ESL is absolutely relevant and important, but you're also providing them with ways to manage that. So one is that ESL, one of the things that we would do is writing program, helping them to write, and really engaging them in way resume writing. How do you market yourself? How do you project yourself? Quite often in many countries, the resumes are very different from the way that they are here in the US. Helping people talk about themselves within this community. Clients have a really hard time talking about themselves in a positive manner, right? That's not how we are taught, right? We don't talk about we call them bragging or playing your own trumpet. That is how you talk when you talk about positive things about yourself. Really helping them focus on their strengths and be able to sit across from you and be able to speak about it. So when you're training them to go for interviews, they don't make eye contact. How do you help them make eye contact? Body language. Talk about their strengths, feel proud about their accomplishments. So those were some of the things that we used to do one-on-one with them, in helping them present themselves, so that when they went for interviews, they were better able to get through those interviews for jobs.
Thank you. So I know we are out of time, and I thank people for their questions. We have all these questions. We will feed them to Rupa. Some of them will answer either directly and post them on the Learning Center, or we'll incorporate some of these additional questions into part 2. Remember, for part 2, that is on June 19th. We'd like to thank Rupa, and then also if you can complete the poll that's on your screen right now, that would be really helpful.
Can I just say one last thing? Sorry. Just one last thing. As I just wanted to thank everybody. This is a lot of information. It's a lot of the work that I have done from my, in my research and with my clients. And I apologize for putting it all in so quickly. But please bear with me, be patient, and I will answer all your questions and provide you with as much as information as would be helpful for your work. So thank you again for being part of this conversation.
Absolutely, Rupa. Thank you. And we know there's certainly a lot of information. There's certainly a lot of questions, and we really appreciate everyone's feedback. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.